Stamps, Arkansas. 1936. A girl is standing in a general store at 5 in the morning, before the heat comes, before the flies come, before the white men come to buy on credit and leave without thanking anyone. She is 8 years old. She has her grandmother's eyes, sharp, black, evaluating, and she is doing something that no one taught her to do and no one told her was unusual. She is reading the labels on the canned goods, not because she is hungry, not because she is bored, because she cannot stop. Because words, for this particular child, do not behave the way they behave for other people. For other people, words are a means of transportation. You use them to get from one idea to another, and then you forget them. For this girl, words are the destination. She reads the label on a can of Carnation evaporated milk, distributed by the Carnation Company, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and she feels something in her chest that she will spend the rest of her life trying to describe and never fully manage to describe, though she will come closer than almost anyone who ever lived. She doesn't know, standing there in the dark with her grandmother's store smelling of sugar sacks and coal oil and the particular warm animal smell of the dried goods her grandmother keeps in the back. She doesn't know that this feeling, this specific relationship between her nervous system and the architecture of language, is not random. She doesn't know it is ancient. She doesn't know it traveled. She doesn't know yet what she is. Here is something the history books don't tell you about Maya Angelou, because the history books, when they bother with her at all, tend to begin with the memoir, with the rape, with the silence, with the recovery. They begin with the wound. They are drawn to the wound the way cameras are drawn to fire. And there is nothing wrong with that. The wound is real. The silence was real. 5 years in which the child, Marguerite Johnson, did not speak a single word to anyone outside her family, because she had made a logic error that would have broken a less extraordinary mind entirely. She had decided that her voice had caused the crime committed against her, and that silence was the only ethical response she had available. 5 years of silence. And then she came back to language. And when she came back with everything. But here is the question that nobody asks. Here is the question that sits underneath the memoir and the poetry and the presidential inauguration and the 6 autobiographies and the honorary degrees and the honorary everything. The question that requires not a biographer but a geneticist and a historian and someone willing to go to the archive in Shreveport, Louisiana on a Tuesday in February, when the heater is broken and the finding aid is incomplete, and the box you need is the 3rd box from the bottom in a stack that hasn't been touched since 1987. The question is, where does a relationship with language like that come from? Not metaphorically, not spiritually. Where does it physically come from? What geography produced it? What people, over what centuries, built the particular internal architecture that would eventually produce a woman who could make a stadium full of people feel, simultaneously, that they were being seen for the first time and that they had always known her? Because it did not come from nothing. Nothing comes from nothing. And the silence in the genealogical record, the wall that every African-American family hits when they push their family history back past 1870, back past the moment the law finally, grudgingly agreed to acknowledge their existence. That silence is not emptiness. It only looks like emptiness. It is actually a door. And on the other side of that door, if you are willing to use the tools that the 21st century has finally made available, the DNA, the haplogroup analysis, the matched reference populations from across the African continent, on the other side of that door is not nothing. On the other side of that door is everything. Start with the name. You always start with the name, because in African American genealogy, the surname is the first clue and the first lie simultaneously. Johnson. Bailey Johnson Sr. was Maya Angelou's father, a Navy dietitian, handsome, unreliable in the specific way that charming men who know they are charming tend to be unreliable. A man who drove a long car and wore good clothes and appeared and disappeared from his children's lives with a breezy confidence that suggested he had never seriously considered the possibility that his appearances and disappearances had weight. Maya wrote about him with a precision that was not quite bitterness and not quite forgiveness, something cooler than both, the kind of assessment you can only make about a person once you have fully accepted that they were never going to be what you needed them to be. His surname, Johnson, which is a name that arrived in the African American community through a mechanism so ubiquitous, so systematic, so deliberately engineered, that it barely qualifies as a choice. In the years immediately following the 13th Amendment, in that chaotic, violent, briefly hopeful stretch of years that historians call Reconstruction, and that the people who lived through it experienced as something more complicated than any single word can hold, formerly enslaved people were faced with the bureaucratic necessity of choosing a surname. Some chose the names of the men who had enslaved them, because those were the only names they had any practical familiarity with, the only names that connected them to the community they knew, the land they knew, the neighbors they knew. Some chose names of famous men they admired, Lincoln, Washington, Jefferson, names that carried a kind of borrowed dignity, a claim on the American promise that the American promise had spent 200 years denying them. Some chose names that meant something in a private language of resistance that the records do not explain and we can only guess at now. And some chose Johnson, which by 1870 was the single most common surname among African Americans in the South. Not because there were that many white Johnsons who had enslaved that many black people, but because Johnson was, in a sense, the most neutral name available, the least specific, the least encumbering. A name that said, I am someone's son. I do not yet know whose. I am beginning. It is a name that contains, if you listen to it carefully, a kind of held breath. Bailey Johnson Sr.'s father was Washington Johnson, a man who appears in the early 20th century records of Lafayette County, Arkansas, with the unelaborated bluntness that characterized the way Southern county records treated black men who had not yet done anything the county clerk considered worth elaborating. He owned a small parcel of land. He attended church. He had children. The documentary record gives him about as much texture as a shipping manifest. Go back further. The texture decreases. The documentation thins like paper held up to light. You can see there is something there, a watermark, a shape, but you cannot read it. The names blur. The county records from the Reconstruction era in Lafayette County, Arkansas, are incomplete in the way that county records from the Reconstruction era tend to be incomplete throughout the Deep South. Partly because the infrastructure of record-keeping had been damaged by a war that had been fought, significantly, across the very ground those records were supposed to be documenting. Partly because the clerks responsible for maintaining those records did not, in the main, consider the documentation of black lives to be among their more pressing professional responsibilities. And partly because in several southern counties, the Reconstruction-era records were specifically and deliberately destroyed in the years after Reconstruction ended and the old order reasserted itself. Destroyed because the records documented things the reasserted order preferred to be undocumented. The wall arrives in Lafayette County, Arkansas, sometime in the 1850s. Before that wall, nothing on paper. The names stop. The generations stop. The legal personhood, such as it was, which was not very such, stops. What remains in the Lafayette County slave schedule of 1860 is a document that you can look at today on a screen in your living room, and that will make you feel, if you let it, the specific cold of a very particular kind of erasure. The document is organized by the names of the enslavers, listed with full names, middle initials, county of residence, the complete administrative dignity that the antebellum South reserved for people it considered real. And beside each enslaver's name, there is a list, not of people, of units. Each unit is described in 3 data points: age, sex, color. That is the entire record of a human life. That is the entire archive. 45, female, black. 12, male, black. 3, female, black. No names, no origins, no languages spoken, no skills, no memories, no parents. No children, unless the children are also on the list, in which case the connection between parent and child is not recorded and must be inferred from proximity and age, the way you infer a sentence's meaning from context when a word has been removed from the middle. Somewhere in the Lafayette County slave schedule of 1860, in a column of ages and sexes and the letter B repeated down the page like a verdict, is the person who was Maya Angelou's great-great-grandmother, or great-great-great-grandmother. The arithmetic of generations in African American genealogy is not always precise, because enslaved people were often not permitted to formalize family relationships, and the ages recorded on slave schedules were frequently estimates. The marshal eyeballing a person the way you would estimate the age of a tree, and writing down a number that was more administrative convenience than biographical fact. She is in there, in the B column, in the estimated ages. She has no name in that document. She has a name in the DNA, the genetic analysis, conducted as part of the research for Professor Henry Louis Gates Jr.'s documentary project on African American genealogy, using mitochondrial haplogroup analysis and autosomal DNA comparison against reference populations drawn from communities across sub-Saharan Africa whose ancestral lines predate the transatlantic trade. Returned a result on Maya Angelou's direct maternal line, that is, once you understand what it means, not a surprise. It is, in fact, the most logical thing in the world. It is the thing that makes everything else make sense in the way that the last piece of a large puzzle makes sense, not by adding something new, but by revealing the shape that was always there. Her maternal haplogroup traces to Sierra Leone, to a people called the Mende. And the moment you hear that, the moment that geographic and ethnic specificity replaces the anonymity of the slave schedule's B column, the entire biography of Maya Angelou reorganizes itself. Every sentence she ever wrote, every interview she ever gave in that voice that journalists struggled to describe and settled on words like resonant and commanding and ancient, as if they could feel they were encountering something older than the woman herself. Every time she talked about language as a physical substance, as something you could hold in your hands and be held by. Every time she described the act of writing as something closer to excavation than invention, as if the words were already there, in the ground, and the job was simply to find them. All of it reorganizes, because the Mende, before the ships, before the barracoons, before the Portuguese and Dutch and British and American slavers, turned the Sierra Leone coast into one of the most brutalized corridors of the entire Atlantic trade. The Mende had built a civilization whose central, defining, organizing principle was the power of the spoken word as the highest form of human authority. Not as entertainment, not as art in the decorative sense, as governance, as medicine, as law, as the technology by which a community maintained its relationship with the sacred and its relationship with itself. The girl standing in the dark general store at 5 in the morning in Stamps, Arkansas, running her fingers along the labels of canned goods and feeling something in her chest that she would spend a lifetime trying to name. She was feeling the mende. She just didn't know it yet. The mende word for a master storyteller is Angelou. Loosely translated, it means the one who unties the knot of meaning. Not the one who creates meaning, the one who finds it, already existing, already present in the fabric of a situation, and releases it into the air where other people can finally breathe it. Maya Angelou never knew that word, but she was it. She was it in every classroom she walked into, and every stage she stood on, and every morning she sat alone in that hotel room with her legal pad and her Bible and wrote sentences that sounded, even in their first draft, like they had already been said 1,000 years ago by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Because in a sense, they had been. In a sense, the sentence was never hers alone. It belonged to the chain of women who had trained their daughters to speak with authority in the sand bush schools of Sierra Leone. It belonged to the unnamed woman in the Lafayette County slave schedule, female, 40, B, who crossed the Atlantic with nothing but what was written in her cells. It belonged to every generation between that woman and the girl in the store reading carnation milk labels in the dark. The word traveled. It traveled the only way it could, through the one channel that no slave schedule could document, and no auction block could assess, and no century of deliberate erasure could interrupt. It traveled in the blood. And one January morning in 1993, it arrived. It arrived on the steps of the United States Capitol, in a January cold that made the breath visible, and it opened its mouth. And what came out was not a poem about politics or a poem about hope in the generic sense that politicians prefer their hope. Manageable, temporary, useful for the news cycle. What came out was old. What came out was the sound of a civilization that had been told repeatedly by the machinery of 4 centuries that it no longer existed. Telling the machinery it was wrong. She died in 2014 in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. She was 86. The legal pad on her bedside table still had writing on it. The girl from Stamps, Arkansas, the girl who went silent for 5 years because she believed her voice had caused a crime, died still writing, still finding the words. Still doing, without knowing its name, what the Mende had always done. Refusing to let the important things go unspoken. Refusing to let the knot of meaning stay tied. Somewhere in Sierra Leone, in a village in the forest that has no reason to know her name, a woman is teaching her daughter to speak in public, to stand without apology, to let the voice carry. She doesn't know she is continuing something. She is.